If you got into a time machine and went back to the early church, would you find an early Christian church that looked like the way that your church looks today? This question for me as an evangelical looking into church history became very important because I realized there are a wealth of sources to tell us how the early Christians lived and worshiped and gathered together that are right there following the time of the New Testament. And there are two things I found that are distinctive, that mark out how the early church worshiped and gathered. So here are those two. If you went back in a time machine, back to the early church, here's what you would see. The first thing is this: bishops. This importance of bishops who had succession back to the apostles was central. In fact, Ignatius of Antioch, writing in the very first centuries, writes that where the bishop is where the church is. It's so fundamental that that church can trace its lineage back to the apostles and those bishops who were laid hands on by the apostles and appointed and their successors. That hierarchical lineage back to the church that Christ founded was central to the way that the early church understood itself. So the first thing you'd see in a time machine is a church that has a bishop in succession with the apostles. The second is this: the centrality of the Eucharist, the celebration of communion, and the real presence of Christ. Justin Martyr, writing in the year 100, gives us a very explicit, very detailed account of how Christians worship on a Sunday morning. And he mentions the centrality of the Eucharist, that the bread and the wine that are celebrated every time Christians gathered actually becomes the real flesh and blood of Jesus. And that all the Christians that were there believed this. And in fact, Ignatius of Antioch, the same guy I mentioned before, tells us that those who don't believe that, they are the heretics. And in fact, it was the same flesh and blood, Ignatius tells us, that died and suffered on the cross. That's how real the real presence was. So hop in a time machine, head back, explore the early church, and let me know what you find.